Looks like this goes all the way to the top. I can't trust anyone, least of all the police, and time's running out. I've got to get the one piece of evidence that will expose Starkweather without a shadow of a doubt. Footage and testimony of a man who was executed by the state 5 hours ago.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So today is the 20-year anniversary of one of the most notorious games from the early 2000s, Manhunt. Released in 2003, developed of course by Rockstar Games. So Manhunt is a game that I've wanted to review for a long time. It's a game that has long been considered one of Rockstar's most interesting and most controversial, as well as a major deviation from their most commercially successful titles, which of course consist of the GTA games. But the game now being 20 years old, and the dust having well and truly settled on it, I figured now would be the perfect time to give it a long, in-depth retrospective review, and finally get to the bottom of what I actually think about the game. Right off the bat, I want to point out that this is going to be a pretty long review, since I do have a lot to say about the game, as well as a lot of mixed feelings on it. Suffice it to say, this is a game that has some really great ideas and concepts, but at the same time, some baffling design choices, and questionable level design. It's a game that in many ways tries to blend together two genres, with varying degrees of success. In retrospect, the game is generally regarded by a lot of gamers as an innovator in the stealth genre, as well as a genuinely atmospheric survival horror game. Me personally, I'm not so sure I'd agree with either of those statements entirely. But I digress, I'll explain more on that later. So the game is a third-person action-adventure game, with both stealth mechanics and survival horror themes. The story of the game is a pretty bleak one. You play as James Earl Cash, a death row inmate, who was believed to have been recently executed for his crimes via lethal injection. However, this wasn't the case, and instead Cash was sedated and taken by a shadowy organisation to be used as sport for a gang of hunters. A mysterious voice calling himself the Director gives you instructions.
These streets are being patrolled by gangs. They're scum, just like you. And they're here to hunt you down and cut you up. I'll try to direct you as best I can, but other than that, you're on your own. It's up to you. Okay, are you ready? Camera, action.
Without giving away too much of the plot, the game takes a lot of inspiration from movies such as Hard Target or The Running Man, in regards to the concept of human beings being hunted for sport. The game begins with a short tutorial where the director gives you instructions on how to play the game.
I'll be frank with you. We set that jump up to see if you had what it takes to be our leading man. A little audition, if you will.
You'll learn pretty much everything you need to know about the game's overall controls and gameplay here. You get introduced to both the stealth and combat mechanics. The game is basically split up into separate levels, each consisting of a particular hunting ground. In these hunting grounds you will have to evade and eliminate various gangs of hunters who are after you. Each hunting ground will be occupied by a different gang with their own style or gimmick. What surprised me about the game in retrospect is that it's surprisingly simplistic. You basically do the exact same thing in every level, with only slight variations, and a few side activities. Make your way from one side of the level to the other, taking out the hunters one by one, using stealth and combat, completing objectives along the way. Speaking of the stealth mechanics, this is something that works to both the game's credit and its detriment. First of all, sneaking up on enemies, hiding in the shadows and exploiting the AI, taking out enemies silently is a lot of fun, particularly in the early part of the game. You basically sneak around quietly like a predator, waiting for your opportunity to strike, in order to perform a silent takedown. However, you will first have to acquire a stealth weapon. There are a whole bunch of these in the game which can be found at various points in each level, such as a plastic bag that can be used to suffocate enemies.
Could do with a trip to the 3-hole.
as well as sharp stabbing weapons such as knives and broken shards of glass.
Break 'em. Oh man, that was good.
You even get strangulation weapons such as wire, similar to the Hitman games. There are a lot of these in the game and they're usually easy enough to find. In an annoying feature, some of these items can only be used once, meaning you'll have to find another one after taking down an enemy, and sometimes these are placed in inconvenient locations. It's not a major issue, but it's something I thought I'd point out. Nonetheless, the vast majority of the game will consist of stealth and stealth takedowns. What sets these stealth takedowns apart from other stealth games is the close-up camera effect that the game transitions to during these takedowns, making it look like an old video camera, giving the game a grainy snuff film look. This was an interesting idea, and I'd say it works given the game's overall theme, though it does get a bit old after a while. You basically sneak up on an enemy, and Cash will automatically get into attack mode, and in this mode you can simply press the attack button to swiftly and silently take out enemies. By holding down the attack button you can even perform more brutal finishing takedowns, though I rarely found a reason or incentive to do this. One thing you will need to do on occasion is maneuver enemies into a vulnerable position. You can do this by simply waiting in the shadows, stalking enemies and waiting for the right time to strike. You can also distract enemies by kicking or interacting with certain items, such as trash cans, and even hitting walls to make noise. In addition to this, you can also find several throwing items that can be used to distract enemies, maneuvering them right where you need them to be for a takedown. I mentioned before the game has combat. In addition to taking down enemies quietly, you can also fight enemies head to head, though this will usually result in you being killed, since James Earl Cash is extremely weak and vulnerable to damage in this game, and enemies are insanely overpowered. You can punch enemies, which, to be honest, barely does any damage at all, and you can also use melee weapons. There are numerous melee weapons in the game, some more powerful and effective than others. That's one thing that actually surprised me about the game in retrospect. To its credit, you get a huge variety of melee weapons throughout, and every single one of them feels different. Some of them can be used for stealth takedowns just like the designated stealth weapons. For example, you have blunt weapons such as baseball bats. You have crowbars. You also have sharp, stabbing weapons such as machetes and meat hooks. At a certain point in the game you even get to use guns. There are several different guns to find and acquire, and these are of course considerably more effective against enemies. For example, you have pistols of various kinds, such as a revolver and even a Desert Eagle. Shotguns such as a sawn-off shotgun or a combat shotgun. Machine guns and assault rifles, and even sniper rifles. You even get some more unique weapons such as a nail gun or a tranquilizer gun. These are all of course very useful and can turn the tide in your favour in combat. With this being a horror and stealth game, ammo is of course very sparse throughout, giving you more of an incentive to use melee weapons and stealth takedowns instead of wasting your ammo. This brings me to one of my main issues I have with this game, and something that made me want to rage quit here and there, the difficulty. Now, I've talked on here in the past about the importance of proper balance in regards to a game's difficulty. A game's difficulty should be somewhat consistent, starting out easier and gradually increasing in difficulty over time. At the same time, if a game is going to be hard, it should be so without cheating the player or feeling unfair. In addition to that, the difficulty should arise from a genuine challenge set by the developers, and not as a result of broken or overlooked technical mechanics. And unfortunately, like several Rockstar games, Manhunt is a complete failure in this regard. Rather than the difficulty increasing over time, as well as my skill as the player increasing along with it, Manhunt doesn't really do that. The difficulty is all over the place, One minute you'll get a level that's insultingly easy, with the AI being ridiculously dumb, takedowns and combat encounters being a joke, and the overall AI being way too easy to exploit, and in some cases just flat out broken. It's actually hilarious here and there.
Whoa, he's in my sights.
Then in the very next level, you'll get an insane difficulty spike, where enemies are basically omnipotent, and the entire level is basically one big trial and error. Seriously, I was able to breeze certain levels just by exploiting several flaws in the game's AI. There were instances where enemies wouldn't be able to see me, despite me being literally right in front of them, as well as the AI just randomly bugging out at times. Then in other levels, enemies would just always know where I was. They'd spot me through walls from halfway across the level and would kill me instantly. There are levels midway through the game that basically throw stealth out the window and force you into combat. The problem here is that this game wasn't really designed with combat in mind, making these levels nothing more than a difficulty spike. You can sneak up on a completely unsuspecting enemy who has no idea whatsoever where you are or what you're about to do, lock onto them to take them out swiftly. Then as soon as you're in range to shoot them, the enemy AI will immediately, and I mean within a fraction of a split second, shoot you to death with inhuman speed, reflexes and accuracy. It honestly doesn't make any sense, and it's nothing more than an artificial difficulty spike. It's the same in regards to the game's melee combat. Your attacks do next to no damage to enemies, and they do way more damage to you, making combat feel completely pointless. Most of the focus during development was clearly on the game's stealth mechanics, which admittedly are pretty good, but why Rockstar felt the need to add levels that basically force you into both melee and ranged combat just made no sense to me. In short, the game's difficulty balance is completely off. You can find painkillers hidden throughout the levels that can refill your health bar, as well as videotapes that act as checkpoints. So it's not completely unfair in this regard, but even with these features, the game's difficulty is still unbalanced. In addition to the stealth and combat, the game also has several escort missions, and of course you guys know how much I love those, which basically force you to traverse a level while protecting a useless NPC. And these levels, while not too difficult, are just boring and tedious. It's interesting because I actually had a lot of fun simply avoiding and taking out hunters in the early levels, and getting used to the stealth mechanics. This was where the game shined in my personal opinion. But adding escort missions and forced combat sections with unfair difficulty spikes just soured the experience for me. What I will say on a positive note is that the game is certainly atmospheric. The levels have a very gruesome, gritty, unsettling feel to them that plays on your natural claustrophobia and fear of being alone and unguarded. Some of the later levels in the game are actually quite terrifying, such as a prison level where you have to navigate maze-like cell blocks to avoid being taken down by maniacs. That level was intense.
You think we should run away? But Mr. Starkweather said...
Sadly, this is pretty much ruined by the game's final act, which basically forces you into numerous shootouts, which for anybody who's ever played a good third-person shooter is going to be pretty boring and tedious. As far as the graphics and presentation go, the game looks great, just like pretty much all Rockstar games. As I mentioned before, the game is grimy, and it works with the atmosphere and tone. The sound design also helps in this regard. Another issue I had with the game was the director. I mentioned before how the director gives you a tutorial, walking you through the early levels and essentially telling you how to play the game. This was fine in the game's tutorial, but unfortunately the director continues to narrate everything for the entire game, and his voice over time actually gets pretty annoying. Seriously, you'll be sneaking up on enemies, taking them out silently in style, and working your way through levels, and the director won't shut up, constantly talking, repeating the same lines of dialogue over and over again, and completely breaking the immersion. Seriously, this pissed me off by the midpoint of the game, since it actually started to ruin the game's overall atmosphere, making it feel like a parody. He's voiced by Brian Cox, who does an acceptable job as the character, but for me he was just overused and I wanted him to shut up. The game also has some hilarious glitches here and there. Sometimes I even got stuck, which was frustrating. So that pretty much covers what the game has to offer. As I said, it's a third-person stealth/survival action horror game, with a lot of interesting ideas, but at the same time some major flaws that hold the game back. In short, it's one of them games where you can certainly see the foundations for what could have been a great game. Unfortunately, the game suffers from some major technical issues, such as inconsistent AI, as well as some major difficulty spikes here and there. And if I'm being honest, as impressive as the game is in spots, there isn't really much replay value, which is a shame considering it's a stealth game. This brings me to one of the issues I have long had with Rockstar, and for me this is a problem with pretty much all their games: the lack of player agency and replay value. This game, like pretty much every Rockstar game, has way too much forced play. What I mean by that is that despite being a stealth game, there's only really one way to practically complete each level. Deviate from that strategy at all and you either blunder your way through the level, or you fail epically. This game came out in 2003, 1 year after Hitman 2 Silent Assassin, which to this day is one of the greatest stealth games ever made. Yet despite that, as I alluded to earlier in the video, Manhunt is considered by many today to be an innovator in the stealth genre. Honestly, I don't understand why people think that, when you consider that the stealth mechanics in this game, while good, are incredibly simplistic, particularly when compared to any of the Hitman games for example. I honestly don't get that narrative at all. Sure, the stealth mechanics here are good for the time, but they didn't do anything that certain older stealth games didn't do better. Another accolade that the game often gets, that in my opinion is completely unwarranted, is the so-called controversy surrounding the game. I've quite often seen this game rated as one of the most edgy, ballsy and subversive games ever made, with people calling it the most violent or offensive game ever made. I don't know about you guys, but I honestly find that to be a bit laughable. I mean, there's really nothing edgy about this game at all. Sure, the game is violent, but it's not that violent. Yeah, sure, you perform close combat takedowns where you kill enemies, but that had been done numerous times in games by 2003. And the game isn't actually that gory even when compared to some games from the time. In addition to that, nothing about the game's story or narrative, or anything the game has you doing, is in my opinion any way edgy or offensive. You kill hunters the entire game, who are all established to be mass murdering sociopaths who are trying to kill you, meaning it's all clearly done in self-defense. Seriously, what's edgy about that? I mean, this game has you killing white supremacists. Come on, you can't get any safer or less edgy than that. It's actually the most safe, milquetoast thing I've ever seen in any piece of media. Oh, look how edgy we are. Our game has you killing people who are regularly demonized and dehumanized by the media in self-defense. So edgy, so controversial. Do me a favour, there's nothing even remotely edgy about this game. It's actually surprisingly safe. Duke Nukem 3D, which came out 7 years before this, was more edgy and more gory than this game was. I honestly think that the whole controversy surrounding this game was largely manufactured by the media to actually help sell the game, because I refuse to believe that it was in any way organic, but I digress. Manhunt is a fun, yet flawed game that had the foundations necessary to be a great one, but unfortunately the questionable level design and the technical issues in the game hold the game back from reaching its full potential. As much as I still enjoy the game, I have to concede that in many ways it didn't age well, and in retrospect my score has to reflect that. I give Manhunt a disappointing yet earned 5 out of 10. It's not a bad game, in fact in many ways it's pretty good. It just happens to have many of the same problems that you get with most of Rockstar's games, holding it back from being great. Thanks for watching, guys. I really enjoyed checking out and reviewing Manhunt. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.
There's a good boy. Now, drop all your weapons and move on.